So, you want to get into Viper, said no one ever. But if you're in the top 0.001% of music listeners and want to become even more niche, or God forbid introduce your friends to Viper, you've come to the right place. Viper is a rapper, entrepreneur, and one-time actor from Houston, Texas that has been active since the late 90s. Back then, he used to run with DJ Screw, a pioneer in the chopped and screwed style, and for all you fellow Zoomers out there, that one guy Travis Scott made a song about, and the Screwed Up Clique. Nowadays, he's generally regarded as a meme, see his 1,000 plus album releases and general online presence. However, he has some legitimately good music under his belt. To some people, he's seen as a pioneer of cloud rap alongside artists like Lil B and Young Lean. Yeah, without Viper, we wouldn't have modern rap, so thank him. Do it now.
If I catch another motherfucker talking sweet about you, 4 and 5, I'm gonna beat their ass!
It's just that all the chaos surrounding his name makes it hard to believe that any of his music has merit. You might think the crack smoke has eroded my brain, but stick around and hopefully I can change your mind. As daunting as 1,000 plus albums worth of material may be, only a fraction of them are entirely original material. I will be covering what people consider to be canon Viper albums, or at least according to Rate Your Music. The rest of the albums in his discography are either chopped and screwed versions of already existing songs or completely recycled songs under different names. To set some expectations, you shouldn't listen to Viper for the lyrical content or even technical ability. His songs are also, for the most part, mixed pretty poorly. Most of the time it adds to the aesthetic, but there are times where it just sounds flat out bad. You can narrow down his song topics to such wholesome topics, including but not limited to crack dealing, murder, and probably some Houston stuff I don't understand, being a filthy non-Texan. He sometimes has lyrically interesting tracks, but I would say most of his appeal is how the production complements his style. In fact, most of his work is self-produced. Hell, you can even hear him messing with the Audacity recording in some of his songs. Speaking of production, he doesn't tend to deviate too much in terms of beat choice. Don't get me wrong, his production is solid, but you'll be hearing that solid sound for most of his discography. Also, if it wasn't clear already, Viper is unsafe for the aux unless they're as mentally deranged as you are for watching this video. This shit is 100% hoe repellent, in the same vein as Death Grips, JPEG Mafia, 99% of the songs on Whole Lotta Red, and whatever indie bands you're into. From his original discography, I can recommend a few albums that would be good for a first-time listener. Hustlin' Thick, originally titled Lead Dog, dropped in 2003 and is drastically different from what he would release afterward. This is the most normal Viper will sound throughout his whole discography. While Viper will maintain the lo-fi aesthetic from this point, Hustlin' Thick has a high amount of boom bap influence and a small touch of West Coast sound. Granted, you won't hear any J Dilla or DJ Premier type beats, but this album barely sounds like it came from Texas, let alone the South. To my knowledge, all the beats here are completely original with no sampling at all. This album is also one of the only to have a hefty amount of guest features. For the most part, they fit on the songs they're present on, but I feel they're kinda trying to outshine Viper on his own album. Hell, he doesn't even have a verse on some of the tracks that have features. This album will definitely appeal to the boom bap / lo-fi hip hop crowd and is a good place to start if you want to slowly ease yourself or other people into Viper's music. Some highlights from Hustlin' Thick include Running the Noise, Rollin', This Is How We Ride, Can It Be Heard, Ride or Die, or Shatter. After this point, he adapted the sound which would eventually become cloud rap. This era of his sound would span from 2006 to 2009. In my opinion, this is peak Viper. His next album, Ready and Willing, released in 2006, and was the start of Viper's change in sound. The reverse R&B sample that runs through I'm Watching These Haters hits like a truck in terms of being jarring, if you decided to listen from the end of Hustlin' Thick straight into this album. The tracks They Can't Fool Me, Blingin', All the Girls Are in Love with Me, My Hustle, and Keep It Real are standout tracks that stick to that style. The other half of this album consists of slow-paced atmospheric tracks. The best of these tracks are You Gon' Die, Feel, What Would It Take, and Ball by the Mall. However, one track really stands out on the album, that track being My Expeditions as a Baller. It's one of the very few tracks where Viper raps over a non-reversed R&B sample at a moderate pace. He also flexes his basketball skills, which won't be the first time he will on a song. Overall, Ready and Willing is a great place to start for anyone who wants to get into Viper's early music. It's not as weird as his other albums, so I'd say show this album to your friends as well. The next starting point I would recommend is 2009's The Hiram Clark Hustler. This album I feel represents this era of Viper's music in the most concise way. It combines the best parts of Ready and Willing and the albums that came before this one. The hazy lo-fi production and the raps are at their most consistent on this album. Hiram Clark has some of the best Viper tracks in my opinion, such as Thug Versus, My Hops, Ball or Die, and Hey, Maybe One Day You'll See Me Again. Some other highlights are the tracks Quick Blast and This G They Wanna Be. This album is a great place to start if you're fine with diving into Viper's sound head on. The last album I would recommend comes from the modern era of Viper, and at the time of writing this is his most recent album, They Hate Me Cause I'm Vaporwave. Said album, released in 2018, is a collaboration between Viper and a bunch of Vaporwave producers I'm not gonna try to pronounce the names of. If Hustlin' Thick was the most normal album, this one would be right before it in terms of normalcy. It's definitely one of the more palatable Viper albums, but being from the modern era, its sound is pretty detached from the last Viper album I talked about. Instead of the cloud rap he helped pioneer, he takes a vaporwave/vapor trap approach to this album. You see, the gap between Hiram Clark and this album is about 9 years, and in those 9 years his style evolved drastically. Despite that, this album is kind of a return to form after those 9 years, but with a more modern trap sound. In fact, a good chunk of the album are what I would call bangers. URSA Swag Major has this crazy sounding dubstep beat that somehow really fits Viper. It's also probably the most hype song in Viper's discography. Another track in this vein is What I'm Spending. Same energy, but with a slightly less dubstep sounding beat. The track Papered Up sounds like a beautiful tribute to Viper's early sound, with those sit arps dominating the track with that recognizable Viper synth whistle running throughout the choruses. Kane Game, Money, Horrific Madness, and Snake Helix are among the more chill and atmospheric tracks on this album. The remaining tracks, Crawl and Death to Snitches, have very experimental sounding beats behind them. Crawl has Viper rapping in a odd time signature with some video game-like drums and atmospheric synths, creating this uniquely crazy vibe that I feel hasn't cropped up in Viper's discography before. Then Death to Snitches has a very stripped back mechanical feeling to it. I would say it sounds like something you would find off a Death Grips or JPEG Mafia album, but everyone compares any experimental rap to them, so go ahead and listen to it by yourself and come to your own conclusions. I also forgot to mention that this project has really polished mixing. It sounds like it would go against Viper sound, but it's actually a benefit here with how complex the beats are on this album. Overall, I think this is a great entry point for Viper in general. In my opinion, this album has no skips. Definitely show this to your friends. Well, I guess it's time to address the elephant in the room. It's the album everyone's been waiting for, 2008's Y'all Cowards Don't Even Smoke Crack. The self-titled opening track is Viper's most iconic song. Anyway, this is where Viper really leaned into that lo-fi aesthetic. As a first for Viper, this album is very stripped in terms of production. On this album, Viper opts to rap over 808s, simple synth melodies, and almost 8-bit like drums. The beats on here almost sound like you'd hear them in a Chinese bootleg ROM hack of Mario Brothers or something. If I had to describe this album as a whole, it's the weirdest sounding Viper album and the hardest to get into from this 2006 to 2009 era. It's one of the albums with the most meme appeal, and whether you see it as a plus is up to you. Some standout tracks from this album are I Sell Dope Boy, I'm That S West Blood, Merciless, Parlayin', and That Baller Out Your Best Side. At the time of writing this, a sequel to Y'all Cowards has been announced. Not sure if it will be new material though, but all in all, I wouldn't recommend this album to a first-time listener. It's still a pretty solid album despite that. Congratulations, you have discovered the rest of Viper's discography. Yeah, I wouldn't recommend listening to these albums before you familiarize yourself with Viper. This is mostly because I don't recommend most of these albums in general. They're either too weird, mediocre, or just flat out terrible.
But that is just my opinion. If you like these albums, that's totally fine.
Heartless Hoodlum, 2006. Sounds like Ready and Willing B-sides, overall a decent album. The Southwest Hooligan, also released in 2006. Kinda sounds like a precursor to Y'all Cowards, they're pretty similar sound-wise. The Paperman, released in 2008. Sounds like B-sides for Heartless Hoodlum and Southwest Hooligan. It's painfully decent and one of the few albums with no highlights for me, in my opinion. Yeah, I'm not reading that title. Released in 2010, this is the first really polished sounding Viper album. The album kinda lacks the coherency that the older albums had. On a track-by-track basis, it's pretty decent, but not as a whole experience. 2010's Lisa Jane, it's not a Viper album. Viper appears on like 2 songs. Lisa Jane sings like a robot pretending to be human, and she's on every track. She ruins the album. But the production is actually pretty solid. Good tracks, none. 2012's 5-9 Pyro Music, The Gang, The Album, The Label. This here kinda marks the transition point from old Viper to new Viper. The production is decent, but it sounds pretty dated by today's standards. And there's a lot of weird grunting throughout the whole album. Rich and Not Famous, released in 2013. This is the album where Viper uses autotune for the first time. It ranges from bearable to awful. The production is really dated and pretty spotty throughout the album. There are a few good beats. Yeah, I don't feel like reading this one. Released in 2014, this was released during the meme era. So half the tracks are recycled material, with the other half being completely original. Viper's autotune here sounds better, but it's still pretty bad. The non-autotune singing weirdly fits the album as well. The Top Mala, released in 2015, has really stripped back production, pretty reminiscent of Y'all Cowards. Most of the beats sound like they were produced on GarageBand with a Fisher-Price keyboard. Death from In Front, released in 2016, sounds like a continuation of Top Mala. Take that as you will. My brain went numb while listening to this. It has a feature, he sounds like Viper basically. World Rap Star, released in 2017. It's his first collab album, a collab with the rapper Nolan. Nolan just kinda sounds okay on the mic. Production is surprisingly good. It was outsourced to the producer Jake Sam. And finally, 2018's Bout the Money. It's a collab with Broken Machine Films. It's Viper's first vaporwave/vapor trap album. It's actually pretty good overall. I would recommend it, but just not for a first-time listener. And we're done. Gosh, that was a lot of albums to go through. You know, when I first found out about Viper, it was during that 1000 plus album run. I literally could not believe this guy was a real artist. I want to shout out the YouTube algorithm for once for actually getting me into Viper's music. As a producer, I started to get into him when this video came up through my recommendations. The first time I listened to him, I was legitimately stunned by how good the production was. Even now, I take some inspiration from Viper in my beats. What really pushed me into becoming a full-on Viper fan, however, was this video right here. Quick side note, if you don't know Dismiss Yourself, it's a channel that uploads relatively obscure music, mostly probably from Bandcamp. Anyway, this video is a perfect gateway into Viper's discography. As the title suggests, it takes the best tracks from Viper's peak and puts them into one video. This comp is sequenced pretty well and even got a cosign from Viper himself. There is also a compilation put out by Dismiss Yourself that covers Viper's music from 2009 onwards. I haven't listened to this one as much, but the tracks on the comp are pretty respectable. Hopefully now you're convinced to give Viper a chance. Maybe you're not, and I completely failed. Whatever, I just wanted to talk about how much I like Viper. If you liked this video, share it around, maybe drop a like. I'm out.